What if the person you trusted most in the world was the one who'd been watching your every move, waiting for the right moment to strike? Vincent Romano sat in his favorite corner booth at Sal's Diner, the same spot he'd claimed every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years. At 72, his days of running the streets were long behind him. These days, he preferred black coffee and crossword puzzles to the life he'd left in the shadows. His phone buzzed against the worn Formica table. An unknown number, 3 words that made his blood run cold. "Your wife is behind you." He didn't turn around. Didn't need to, because in that moment, 30 years of marriage collapsed into a single, terrible understanding. His hand trembled as he set down his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid ripple like his suddenly uncertain world. "Where are you watching from?" Vincent Romano hadn't always been the kind of man who spent his mornings doing crossword puzzles in a diner. There was a time when his name carried weight in certain circles, when a word from him could change lives or end them. But that was decades ago, before his daughter was born. Before he'd looked at his newborn girl's face and decided some legacies weren't worth passing down. He'd walked away clean, made his peace with the families, paid his debts. For 30 years, he'd lived quietly in their modest home in Queens, working security jobs, going to his granddaughter's school plays, being the husband Eleanor deserved, Eleanor. His Ellie. They'd met when he was 42 and she was 38, both of them thinking love had passed them by. She was a nurse at Mount Sinai, working the night shift when he'd come in with a knife wound he'd claimed was from a kitchen accident. She'd known better, had seen through him with those steady gray eyes. But she'd stitched him up anyway and told him he was too smart to die stupid. 6 months later, they were married at City Hall with 2 friends as witnesses. She'd never asked about his past, and he'd never volunteered the details. That was their unspoken agreement. They'd built a good life together. A small house with a garden where Ellie grew tomatoes and basil. Sunday dinners with their daughter Maria and her family. Quiet evenings where they'd sit on the porch, holding hands while the neighborhood kids played stickball in the street. Vincent had thought himself blessed, thought he'd finally outrun the ghosts of who he'd been. The text message sat on his phone like a stone in his chest. He still hadn't turned around, but he could feel her presence behind him now, could hear the soft click of her sensible shoes on the diner's tile floor. How many times had she joined him here, sliding into the booth across from him with her own cup of tea, chatting about their plans for the day? How many mornings had he looked at her face and thought himself the luckiest man alive? "Vinny?" Her voice was the same as always, warm and familiar, with that slight hoarseness from the cigarettes she'd given up 20 years ago. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. Eleanor stood there with 2 shopping bags, her silver hair pulled back in the neat bun she always wore, a concerned crease between her eyebrows. She looked exactly like the woman he'd woken up next to that morning, the woman who'd kissed his cheek and reminded him to take his blood pressure medication. "Sit down, Ellie," he said quietly. Something in his tone made her hesitate. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Fear, calculation, then it was gone, replaced by her usual gentle smile as she slid into the booth across from him. "What's wrong?" she asked, reaching for his hand across the table. He pulled his hand back. The gesture was small, but it echoed between them like a gunshot. Eleanor's smile faltered. "Vinny, you're scaring me. How long?" The question came out rougher than he intended, an old man's voice cracking with emotion he'd spent a lifetime learning to control. How long what? But her eyes told him she understood perfectly. Vincent picked up his phone, turned it so she could see the screen. 3 words. "Your wife is behind you." He watched her face carefully, the way he'd once watched men's faces across poker tables and in dark parking lots, looking for tells, for the truth beneath the mask. Eleanor went very still. Her hands, which had been resting on the table, slowly withdrew to her lap. When she looked up at him again, the mask was gone. What he saw in her eyes was something he'd never seen before, something cold and calculating, something that belonged in his old world, not in the life they'd built together. "Who sent that?" she asked, her voice different now, harder. "You're not going to deny it?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying him the way a chess player studies the board. Outside, a bus rumbled past. Someone laughed. Normal sounds from a normal world that suddenly felt very far away. "Would you believe me if I did?" she finally asked. The simple honesty of the question hit him harder than any denial would have. Because it meant she was past pretending, past the 30 years of gentle lies and careful performances. Whatever this was, whoever Eleanor really was, she'd decided to let him see it. Vincent felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart exactly. Something deeper. The foundation he'd built his second life upon. "Who are you?" he whispered. Eleanor's expression softened, but not with love. With something that looked almost like pity. "The same person I've always been, Vinny. You just never asked the right questions." The diner suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Vincent's training, dormant for decades, kicked in automatically. He scanned the room. Old Tom at the counter nursing his coffee. 2 women in a booth by the window deep in conversation. A teenager with headphones in, ignoring his pancakes while scrolling through his phone. Nothing suspicious. Nothing obvious. "We should go somewhere private," Eleanor said, reading his thoughts the way she'd always done. Except now he wondered what else she'd been reading, what other parts of him she'd studied and cataloged over the years. "I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what's happening." His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. At 72, he wasn't the man he'd once been. His reflexes were slower, his body softer, and the woman across from him was suddenly a stranger. Eleanor sighed, a sound so familiar it made his chest ache. How many times had he heard that exact sigh when he'd left his socks on the bathroom floor or forgotten to water her tomatoes? "It's not what you think," she said. "You don't know what I think." "Yes, I do." Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw the woman he'd married, the one who'd held his hand through his daughter's wedding and his mother's funeral. "You think I've been lying to you from the beginning. You think our entire marriage was some kind of assignment or con. You think I never loved you." The accuracy of her words stole his breath. That was exactly what he'd been thinking, feeling, drowning in since that text message had arrived. But hearing her say it out loud made it somehow worse. "Have you?" The question barely made it past his lips. Eleanor reached into her purse. Vincent's hand instinctively moved toward his side, where he'd once carried a gun. Her eyes tracked the movement, sad and knowing. She pulled out not a weapon, but an old photograph, creased and faded. She slid it across the table. Vincent picked it up with numb fingers. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, standing next to a man in his 40s. The man wore an expensive suit and a cold smile. The girl's eyes were empty, haunted. It took him a moment to recognize the girl as a younger Eleanor. And the man, his stomach dropped. The man was Frank Castellano. Frank had been his mentor once, back in the old days. A brutal man who'd ruled his territory with an iron fist and no mercy. Frank had disappeared 40 years ago, supposedly killed in a power struggle Vincent had carefully avoided getting involved in. "He was my father," Eleanor said quietly. "My father and my nightmare." The diner's sounds faded to white noise. Vincent stared at the photograph, then at his wife, then back at the photograph. Pieces were shifting in his mind, forming patterns he didn't want to see. "You knew who I was," he said. "When we met at the hospital, you knew." "I knew." She folded her hands on the table, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. "I'd been looking for you for 2 years. To kill me. It wasn't a question. To understand you." Eleanor's voice carried a weight of old pain. "My father talked about you sometimes when he was drunk. Said you were the smartest one. The one who'd get out while the rest of them killed each other over scraps. I hated you for that. Hated that you got to walk away clean while I was trapped in that life. Cleaning up his messes, watching him destroy everything he touched." Vincent felt like he was falling through ice, the cold truth of her words pulling him under. "So you found me, then what? Why the marriage? Why 30 years? Because somewhere between planning to ruin you and actually meeting you, I realized something." Eleanor's eyes were wet now, genuine tears that made her look both younger and infinitely older. "You really had gotten out. You'd actually done it. And when you looked at me in that emergency room, you didn't see Frank Castellano's daughter or a piece in some game. You saw me, just me. She reached across the table again, and this time he didn't pull away. Her hand was warm and familiar, the same hand that had held his through surgeries and celebrations, through ordinary days and extraordinary ones. I fell in love with you, Vinny. Not because of some plan, but because you were kind, because you made me laugh, because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw something worth loving instead of using. Her voice broke. These 30 years, they've been real. Every moment, every day. I swear to you on our daughter's life, they've been real. Vincent wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But 40 years ago, before he'd learned to trust, before he'd believed in second chances, he'd been a different man. A man who understood that in their world, love was the most dangerous con of all. If you're feeling the weight of Vincent's heartbreak right now, hit that thumbs up button. Sometimes the hardest betrayals are the ones we never see coming. Then who sent the text? He asked. Who knows? And what do they want? Eleanor's face hardened, the softness replaced by something steel-edged and dangerous. That, she said, is what we need to find out. Because whoever it is, they didn't send you that message out of kindness. They're trying to destroy us, Vinny, and they're not going to stop with one text. They went home. Not because it was safe, but because after 30 years, it was the only place that still made sense to Vincent. The house stood quiet on its tree-lined street, exactly as they'd left it that morning. The tomato plants Ellie had been nursing all summer hung heavy with fruit. The porch still held the 2 rocking chairs they'd bought at an estate sale 15 years ago. Everything looked normal, but Vincent knew better now. Normal was a lie. They'd been living, and someone had just ripped away the curtain. Inside, Eleanor moved through their home with purpose, checking windows, drawing blinds. Vincent watched her, seeing her differently now. The efficient movements, the way she assessed angles and sight lines. How had he never noticed? Or had he noticed and chosen not to see? Sit down, she said, gesturing to the kitchen table where they'd eaten thousands of meals together. I need to tell you everything. And then we need to figure out who's coming for us. Us? Vincent asked bitterly. You mean me. Someone's coming for me, and you were their way in. Eleanor's face crumpled, and for the first time since the diner, she looked her full 68 years. She sank into a chair, suddenly fragile in a way that made his chest ache despite everything. You have every right to hate me for not telling you. But Vinny, please. I stopped being Frank Castellano's daughter the day I married you. I chose you. I chose this life. He sat down across from her because his legs suddenly felt too weak to hold him. Tell me, he said. All of it. So she did. Haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, Eleanor unfolded a story he'd never imagined. How she'd grown up in the shadow of her father's violence, trained from childhood to be useful to him in ways that made Vincent's stomach turn. How she'd learned to watch, to wait, to gather information. How she'd been her father's eyes and ears, until the day she'd watched him beat a man to death over a poker debt. I was 16, she said, her voice hollow with old grief. I knew then I had to get out or become him. So I trained as a nurse, kept my head down, waited for my chance. When he died, and yes, he's actually dead, not hiding somewhere, I thought I was free. But you can't just walk away from that life, can you? The skills stay with you, the instincts. Vincent understood that better than anyone. He'd spent decades trying to forget how to read people for weaknesses, how to plan 3 steps ahead, how to survive in a world where trust was currency and everyone was for sale. When I found you, Eleanor continued, I was angry and lost and looking for someone to blame for why my life had been what it was. But Vinny, that first conversation in the emergency room, when you made me laugh about being clumsy with kitchen knives, that was the first genuine moment I'd had in years, and I wanted more of them. I wanted more of you." She pulled out a manila folder from the drawer beside her, one he'd never seen before. Inside were documents, photographs, news clippings, a paper trail of a life she'd kept hidden. "I've been protecting you," she said, "all these years. There are people out there who still remember Vincent Romano, who'd still like to settle old scores. I've been watching, listening, making sure none of them got close enough to hurt you or Maria or the grandkids." Vincent looked at the evidence of her secret life, spread across their kitchen table like a confession. Photos of men he'd once known, now crossed out or annotated with dates and locations. Notes in her careful handwriting tracking movements, meetings, threats. For 30 years, while he'd thought himself retired and safe, she'd been standing guard. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. "Because you deserved peace." Eleanor reached for his hand, and this time he let her take it. "Because you'd earned the right to be just a grandfather who worried about crossword puzzles and tomato plants. Because I loved you enough to carry that weight alone." The tears he'd been holding back finally came, surprising him with their heat. At 72 years old, Vincent Romano cried at his kitchen table, mourning the simple life he'd thought he had while discovering the depth of love that had actually protected it. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved was hiding a part of themselves to protect you? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the biggest lies are told out of the deepest love. Eleanor cried too, their hands clasped together across the table like a bridge over 30 years of half-truths and whole devotion. But even in that moment of raw honesty, Vincent's mind was working, the old instincts kicking in. "The text message," he said, wiping his eyes. "If you've been protecting me all these years, who got close enough to know about us? Who's watching us right now?" Eleanor's face went pale. "I don't know. But Vinny, that's what scares me most, because I've been so careful. Unless..." She stopped, a terrible understanding dawning in her eyes. "Unless what?" "Unless they're not from your past," she whispered. "Unless they're from mine." The second text arrived 20 minutes later, while they were still sitting at the kitchen table, hands clasped, trying to make sense of a lifetime of deception and devotion. Vincent's phone buzzed, and they both flinched like gunshots had been fired. "Bella's Pizza. 7 p.m. Come alone, or your granddaughter learns what Grandpa used to do for a living." Vincent's blood turned to ice. His granddaughter Sophie, 8 years old, with his daughter Maria's dark curls and Eleanor's gray eyes. The child who taught him that redemption was real, that you could become someone new, someone better. Eleanor read the message over his shoulder, and he felt her grip tighten on his hand. "They're not just threatening you," she said. "They're threatening everything we've built. Everyone we love. I'm going alone." Vincent's voice was firm, but Eleanor shook her head. "No, we're going together. Whatever this is, we face it the way we should have faced everything, as partners." For a moment, Vincent saw his wife clearly. Not the nurse he'd married, not Frank Castellano's hidden daughter, but both women at once. The one who'd bandaged his wounds, and the one who'd watched his back. The one who'd made him laugh, and the one who'd been willing to sacrifice her peace for his. She'd been protecting him for 30 years. Maybe it was time he returned the favor. "Together," he agreed. They spent the afternoon preparing, and Vincent was amazed by how naturally they fell into old patterns neither of them had used in decades. Eleanor retrieved a gun he'd never known she kept, hidden behind the loose board in their bedroom closet. Vincent made calls to people he'd thought were dead or gone, activating networks that had lain dormant for half a lifetime. Together, they were formidable in a way that would have terrified him that morning. Now, it felt right, like finally seeing the full picture after looking at a puzzle piece for 30 years. At 6:45 p.m., they drove to Bella's Pizza in Vincent's ancient Buick. The restaurant sat on a corner in a neighborhood that had gentrified around it. The old pizza place now surrounded by organic juice bars and boutique coffee shops. Vincent had been coming here since it opened, back when the neighborhood was different, when men like him ran these streets. They parked across the street and waited, watching. Old habits died hard. "I see one person," Eleanor murmured. "Back booth. Can't make out details." Vincent's heart hammered in his chest, the way it used to before important meetings, before moments that could change everything. But now his hand was steady on the door handle, and Eleanor's presence beside him felt like armor. They crossed the street together and entered Bella's. The smell of oregano and baking dough hit Vincent like a memory. Tony Bella, the owner's son, nodded at him from behind the counter, not knowing, not caring about the drama walking through his door. The person in the back booth was young, maybe mid-30s, wearing a leather jacket and an expression that tried for dangerous but landed somewhere closer to desperate. As they approached, Vincent felt Eleanor tense beside him, and he knew she'd recognize something he hadn't. "Hello, Aunt Eleanor," the young man said. Vincent watched his wife's face cycle through shock, recognition, and a weary kind of sadness. "David," she breathed. "Frank's grandson. I thought I'd died with my mother in that car accident 15 years ago." David's smile was bitter. "That's what everyone was supposed to think. But some of us don't get clean exits like you did, Aunt Eleanor. Some of us are still living with the consequences of what our family did." Eleanor slid into the booth across from David, and Vincent followed, his mind racing to rearrange the pieces. A nephew. Family Eleanor had never mentioned, had maybe thought dead. Another secret in a day of revelations. "What do you want?" Eleanor's voice was steady, but Vincent could hear the pain underneath. David pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. Inside were documents, financial records, property deeds. Grandpa Frank had money hidden, a lot of money, and according to these documents, before he died, he transferred it all to you. You inherited everything, Aunt Eleanor, everything he built on blood and suffering. And you just, his voice cracked, you just disappeared. Started a new life with this guy, played house, while my mother and I struggled with nothing. Vincent looked at Eleanor, saw the truth in her eyes. She had known, maybe not at first, but at some point, she'd known about the money and chosen not to touch it. Chosen poverty over blood money, another sacrifice she'd made for their clean life together. If this story has touched you, if you're invested in seeing how Vincent and Eleanor navigate this final challenge, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of love, redemption, and second chances. Your support helps us share these important stories. "I never touched that money," Eleanor said quietly. "I couldn't. It was poison. Poison you could have used to help family," David shot back. "My mother died because we couldn't afford her cancer treatment. Did you know that? Did you even think about us while you were playing Happy Family in Queens?" Vincent felt Eleanor's pain like it was his own, and in that moment, he made a choice. He reached across the table, not with anger, but with understanding. "Son," he said gently, "let me tell you what I learned about that kind of money, and then let's figure out how we make this right." The conversation at Bella's Pizza lasted 3 hours. Vincent ordered food they barely touched while David poured out a story of loss and anger and survival that mirrored Eleanor's own childhood in too many ways. He'd grown up watching his grandfather's violence, had been shaped by Frank Castellano's legacy just like his aunt. But where Eleanor had found a way out through Vincent, David had been left behind, forgotten, struggling with a sick mother and the weight of a terrible inheritance. Eleanor listened with tears streaming down her face, years of guilt and grief finally finding their release. She'd known her brother had died young, Frank's own son, lost to drugs and violence. But she'd never known about David, never imagined that her escape had left family behind. "I'm sorry," she said, when David's story finally ran out of words. "I'm so sorry, David. I was so focused on getting away, on surviving, that I never looked back to see who I'd left behind. That was wrong. That was selfish." David's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by exhaustion. "I don't want revenge," he finally admitted. I just want to understand why you got to be happy when the rest of us suffered. Vincent spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. Because your aunt made a choice to stop the cycle. She chose not to touch that poisoned money. She chose to build something clean, even if it meant being poor. That took courage, son. More courage than staying in that life ever would have. He paused, then continued. But you're right that she could have looked back. That she should have. We both should have. When you run from your past, sometimes you forget that other people are still living in it. Vincent pulled out his phone and made a call. One he'd been thinking about since David had mentioned his mother's death. Tommy, it's Vinny Romano. Yeah, after all these years. Listen, I need you to track down some information about inherited assets. The conversation was brief, but purposeful. Vincent had connections, favors owed, and ways to make things happen even in his supposed retirement. When he hung up, he looked at David with clear eyes. That money your grandfather left? Eleanor never touched it because it was wrong. But there are ways to make wrong things right. We're going to find where that money is. And we're going to use it the way it should have been used. For family, for the people Frank hurt. There are organizations, support systems for families affected by violence. We'll set up something in your mother's name. David stared at them, disbelief and hope warring on his young face. Why would you do that? Eleanor reached across the table, taking her nephew's hand. Because family means more than blood. It means not repeating the mistakes of the people who came before us. Your grandfather was my father, and he was a monster. But that doesn't mean you and I have to carry that darkness forward. We can be better. We can choose different. Slowly, David's rigid posture softened. He was crying now, the tough exterior finally cracking to reveal the hurt and lonely young man underneath. I've been so angry, he whispered. For so long, I didn't know how to let it go. Anger's easier than grief, Vincent said, thinking of his own journey from the violent man he'd been to the grandfather he'd become. But it's grief that lets you heal. Grief that lets you move forward. They stayed at Bella's until closing time, Tony Bella eventually joining them with fresh pizza and the kind of wisdom only old neighborhood guys understand. They talked about Frank Castellano not as a legend or a nightmare, but as a flawed man whose choices had rippled through generations. They talked about forgiveness, not for him, but for themselves, about how you can't choose your family's past, but you can choose what you do with your future. By the time they left, David had agreed to let them help him. Not just with the money, but with building a life free from the shadows of their shared history. Vincent offered connections. Eleanor offered the kind of love she'd wished someone had offered her at David's age. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans for Sunday dinner, began the slow work of healing wounds that had festered for years. Driving home, Eleanor rested her hand on Vincent's knee, the way she had for 30 years. I should have told you everything from the beginning, she said. Maybe, Vincent agreed. Or maybe we both needed time to become the people who could handle this truth. 30 years ago, I was different. Harder, less forgiving. I might not have understood what you were trying to do. And now, he covered her hand with his own. Now I understand that love isn't about having no secrets. It's about trusting someone enough to tell them eventually. It's about building something good even when you come from something broken. They pulled into their driveway, and Vincent looked at their small house with its tomato garden and rocking chairs. Tomorrow, they'd start the complicated work of making amends, of tracking down Frank's money and turning it toward healing instead of harm. Tomorrow, they'd call Maria and explain carefully, appropriately, that their family had gotten a little bigger. Tomorrow, they'd begin again, together, with all truths finally laid bare. But tonight, they were just Vinny and Ellie, two old people who'd found each other in the darkness and made light. I love you, Eleanor said as they walked to their front door hand in hand. Every version of you. The man you were, the man you became, the man you still are. I love you too, Vincent replied. All of you, even the parts I'm still learning about. Behind them, the neighborhood settled into evening. Children called home to dinner, dogs barked at passing cars, televisions flickered in windows. Normal life, the kind Vincent and Eleanor had fought so hard to have, the kind they'd protect for each other and for their family. Whatever form that family took, some betrayals, Vincent realized weren't really betrayals at all. Sometimes they were acts of love so profound, so self-sacrificing, that they looked like lies until you understood the whole story. And some endings were really beginnings, chances to take broken pieces and build something whole. The stranger's text that morning had threatened to destroy them. Instead, it had revealed the depth of what they'd built together. 30 years of love, protection, sacrifice, and hope. That was a foundation strong enough to weather any truth. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on forgiveness and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the complexity and beauty of human connection. Thank you for sharing this journey with Vincent and Eleanor. Sometimes the truth sets us free, even when it hurts. Especially then.